Good morning, social media breakfast of Houston. Oh my gosh, we are meeting. We always meet, even if we can't meet live in person, we meet live in person, right, Jeff?
That's right.
I've had social media breakfasts in snowstorms, rainstorms. We've had them and shifted them. I think the last time we pivoted majorly was in Harvey. We changed what we were going to do and we did a community outreach situation. So whatever we do, guys, we are like diehards around here for social media breakfast. So I am so excited you're joining us. I see all of the eyeballs coming in on the screen here. Please comment and tell us you're here. Tell us, say, I'm here. Let us, so you can let Jeff and I know that you're here today. And we will be having a conversation. It's not going to be exactly the same, but definitely make sure you put your comments and questions in the comments underneath this post, because I can actually see them. The StreamYard brings them in and I can see them and I can actually put them across our screen and talk to you guys. And then afterward, about 9:29, 30, we are going to jump over to Blue Jeans. And by the way, the hi everyone, good morning in the chat is Katie. She's here. She's in the comments with you guys. So please leave your comments. And this is how I can show your comments. So make sure you come by and give me a comment or two. So Jeff, how are you doing? How are you holding up in this lovely new world that we're living in here?
It is a new world. I'm doing okay. I'm hanging in there, ups and downs for sure. We're very fortunate business-wise that things are pretty solid and our clients are very understanding and they're on the forefront of stitching together the social safety net. So they're busy and they're keeping us busy, which is very nice. But it's definitely a new world and it's taking a lot of adjustment. And I'm just trying to be disciplined and improve myself. And, I'm doing more yoga and walking my dogs more. I shouldn't say that too loud or else they'll start to freak out.
Yeah, you just let them in.
I'm adjusting. Yeah, exactly.
We were just talking about dogs and children. And so if you guys are home with dogs, children, husbands, wives, partners, whatever, just realize that we are all in the same boat together. And you know what I just realized? I left my tea downstairs. So that's the tea. Aha, my kids would say. So good morning, Marianne Worsham. Oh, you're from, we've got somebody here from Savannah. Hi, Marianne. Hi. And Elaine Mays. Hi, Elaine. Good morning. How are you? Good morning to you too. I'm really excited to have the people here that are here. And I see you guys are kind of tuning in. So make sure you guys share this on your own timeline so that other people see it. You know how it is with Facebook. We go live and we've done the best we can to get everybody notified. So just make sure you share it on your profile so that other people can see it too and join us. So Jeff, you were talking about your company and what you're doing. And this is crazy because we decided to do this well before any of this COVID coronavirus problems happened. But really, I asked you to come because you are brilliant and your company is brilliant at taking data sets, like big data sets, what's sexy and cool big data, and turning them into stories that people can kind of grasp and understand. Because I think data can be a little overwhelming and stressful. But since we've started this virus, every day is full of like charts and graphs and I really also want to maybe talk a little bit about how to read those and understand them and maybe what we should be looking for and all of that. But
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about January Advisors, what you guys do. You've been a long time social media breakfast attender, like since the very beginning, I think. So tell us a little bit about what you do, because you're not a marketer in the true sense. So kind of share with us.
For sure. Well, I love marketing and I love social media breakfast, and thank you for having me on. This is really fantastic. And thank you everybody for attending. This is a good, happy Friday and it's nice and cool in Houston. So all signs point to a decent day. January Advisors is a data science consulting firm. We work with governments and nonprofits, helping them understand the world through data. I'm particularly passionate about exploring data. So those big abstract data sets, I love pulling that into statistical software and messing around with it, exploring it, seeing what I can find, trying new tools and techniques, learning new programming skills. And so through that exploration, I've learned a lot about how to visualize data and how to explain data I have a background in writing and narrative, so I'm very attuned to storytelling, and data helps me understand from, I'll have an intuitive sense of the world, and then data helps either confirm or disconfirm that intuitive sense. So it really helps me be a more well-rounded person. And I'm very fortunate that I've been able to find a profession that allows me to marry the two together, to really explore this abstract data and extract the stories out of it that are significant, and then be able to visualize and tell those stories in ways that everybody can understand, whether or not you have that type of domain expertise.
Yeah. And you've had a couple of particular projects you've been working on really even before coronavirus started, but I'd like to talk about those and kind of give us a sense of the kinds of things you're gathering data on. You've gathered data on a lot of things, but I remember when open data was starting to happen with the government, and you kind of hooked into that, and that's kind of where you're getting your data. So I want to talk to that a bit. But so what are your main projects right now that you're working on around data and storytelling?
Sure. So one of my, the thing I'm most passionate about right now, or one of the things I'm most passionate about, is evictions. Evictions is extremely relevant right now. Housing is public health. If you don't have a home, if you're housing unstable, that is a health risk. And so it's very important that we, during this economic calamity, during this public health crisis, stabilize people's housing. Because if you lose your housing, if you are evicted, or if you are unstable in some way, you're couch surfing, that is incredibly detrimental. If you have kids, it's an education crisis. If you're hungry, it's a food crisis. If you're evicted, it's the equivalent of PTSD. It's a traumatic event, and so you have a mental health crisis. So when we look at the burden on the social safety net and all the providers that make up that social safety net, it's really important to look at the ways in which we can intervene and stabilize people to prevent an excess burden. We talk about flattening the curve with COVID-19 and not burdening hospital beds. I think of it the same way with the social safety net and stabilizing housing. And in Houston, it's particularly interesting because we have way more evictions than we thought. In previous studies of evictions in Houston, they've underestimated significantly the number of evictions that happen. And so when we started to pull our data from the Harris County Justice of the Peace, we were shocked at how many evictions there actually are. And we started to do a study around it. And we started to look at what we've been thinking for the last 6 months. What are the ways in which we could pause evictions and somehow open a window and put in social services to stabilize housing? Then all of a sudden there's this public health crisis and evictions are frozen until the end of the month. And so what we're really trying to do is evangelize this idea that evictions are worse than we thought in Houston, and try to marshal as many community resources as possible to help keep people in their homes. I can talk about lots of stuff, but evictions is definitely top of mind right now.
Well, I think so. It's really hard to stay at home if you don't have a home. So I think it's good that they've frozen the evictions for now. Certainly, there's a lot that goes into that, and I've read some of your stuff. So what's really great is that, and I can ask you to put that in the comments because it will show up now. If people want to get on your newsletter, you can go to januaryadvisors.com and get on the newsletter, and I get your stuff pretty much regularly. And by the way, I was changing my branding. Sorry, guys, I had the other branding on. That's the cool thing about StreamYard, by the way. You can change it up for whatever you're on. Sorry about that. So yeah, January Advisors. January Advisors has a really great newsletter that he puts out that talks about some of this data. So can you kind of explain, like, I mean, landlords need their rent too. So like, how do you how do you get this data to work for like showing the evictions issue, and what has the data been showing you, I guess, is maybe the best way to ask that question.
That's a good question. Well, for one, evictions are a symptom, not a cause. Evictions are a symptom of poverty and economic problems. And so when we have massive amounts of evictions, what that tells us is that our economy is not serving everybody. There's a significant number of working poor in Houston, people who have jobs, people who simply can't make enough money to keep up with the cost of housing and to keep up with the costs of essentially being poor. It's very expensive to be poor. And if you've never been poor, then you probably don't know how much it costs to cash a paycheck, or how much it costs to, go buy something on layaway. it's very expensive. And so what it says to me is that there's underlying economic conditions that are very bad. When we have a massive amount of people who can't pay rent, it obviously affects landlords considerably. And I'm not a class warrior. I don't think, oh, down with the landlords, landlords have to pay their note too. But I think that first we have to stabilize tenants, then we can worry about landlords. And it should be a 1-2 punch, but number one priority should be ensuring that people don't get evicted. From there needs to be some type of mortgage relief, such that as renters can't pay their rent, landlords shouldn't be expected to pay their note to the bank. And I think that people are starting to think this through, because the massive economic impact of COVID-19 is such that this is not just a working poor problem anymore. This is a middle class problem now. And when these types of economic conditions infiltrate the middle class, it threatens to destabilize everything. So I think people are taking it very seriously. And from my perspective, what it means is that we can address the fundamental issues in our economy that lead to the working poor getting caught in the gears, and address the middle class landlord type issues as well.
Well, I mean, and almost anybody that I would dare say all of us on this call, all of us on this video know somebody who's lost their job in the last, 2 weeks, and beyond. So I know, a dozen myself just off the top of my head. So the question is, where do we go with that? Because I mean, it's going to really impact a much higher, we can kind of forget about the poor sometimes and think, well, but they're having trouble even getting food. I was listening to a report the other day of this family that they don't have a grocery store that's nearby, and their car battery died, and they can't get to a grocery store except for once in a while. They can call to get some assistance through the bus line, and Metro has some stuff going on around that. But the only place they can get food really is at like local convenience stores that are nearby. And then those prices have gone over the roof because, well, everything's gone through the roof because you can't find toilet paper. You can't find, everything is like supply and demand, right? So there you go. And then when they do go to this grocery store, the things that they need may or may not be available. So they can go once a month, maybe, to a grocery store. So I don't know. I just think that we're going to see it more in our face, which is not something we normally do. So unless you're like in that situation. So I think it's great. So the question is, though, how are you using data to get there? So this is your story. This is where you come to. So where's the data? Show me the cheese, friend.
Yeah. So I think, for one, it's really important for governments to embrace open data, like you were saying before. My company was involved in crafting the first open data policy for the city of Houston. And we're big advocates of open data. We wrote that back in 2013. And I guess that was 7 years ago now.
I know.
And so
it's like we're getting old, Jeff.
I know. But it's critically important for governments to be transparent as much as possible, without compromising personal security, in ways that can help researchers and companies like mine make sense of the data and be innovative. Because when we have a crisis, this is a perfect time for innovation. When we had the financial collapse of 2008, that was a great time for innovation. I don't mean to bright side it, because so many people get hurt in the process. And I never want to forget about that. It's easy to get lost in the numbers when you work with data. We talk about 25,000 evictions a year in Harris County. That's 25,000 families. That's almost 100,000 people. That's like Woodstock. I think of like opening the fold, the gatefold of the Woodstock record, and looking at all those people. That happens every year in Houston alone. The scale is just enormous. And so when we think about who's going to be affected by this impending economic collapse, and I don't mean to bright side it, and I also don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but we're in for a rough ride. And I think that we better buckle up. And I think that for me in particular, it's an interesting experiment to be thinking about the worst possible outcomes at all times and how we can make lemonade from lemons. We have tremendous assets in Houston, community assets. We also have tremendous wealth in Houston, maybe not for much longer with the oil collapse, but we have a lot of very generous people. We know that we've got a great spirit here, and it really showed up during Hurricane Harvey. Everybody was a hero. And I think that what we need to do is find that within us right now, even when we don't have a lot, to try and figure out what are the right moves, what are the ways in which government can stabilize and provide for people, especially for the most destitute or the most at risk people in our communities, because those people are the ones that we need to stabilize first. And then we need to think about how are we going to stabilize our middle class, which is kind of that bulk of the middle. And we're going to see some radical reforms. I wasn't necessarily a Bernie Sanders, supporter. I'm a fan of Bernie Sanders, but I'm not necessarily, a Bernie bro, so to speak. But I think a lot of the things that he talks about are very relevant right now in terms of how government can provide a basic standard of living for people such that they're not in the streets. I talk about this a lot. I probably shouldn't say this on social media breakfast, but we're being candid and I can't see everybody. So
yeah, so they're not going to throw tomatoes at you right now. I mean, they might later. It's good.
But I think a lot about Hamas and the Gaza Strip and how Hamas 10, 15 years ago was democratically elected by the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And you think as a Jewish American, I've been taught that Hamas is a terrorist group, and Hamas is, certainly has done awful things in the world. And so it kind of is confounding. Like, why would people vote for people with M16s on their back? But they've got M16s on their back, but they're bringing food. They're bringing medical supplies. They're digging latrines. They're building infrastructure. They're providing a standard of living for the people that is necessary, because when you have mass poverty, people get very desperate and they're willing to embrace people who are helping them. And I think that you have to be careful as to who's doing the helping, because you can ingratiate yourself to this massive amount of people who just need help. They just need food, or they just need housing. The more that America ignores that problem, and the more that we ignore the poor, because I agree with you, it's very easy to ignore the homeless issue. It's very easy to ignore the working poor if you're not one of them, if you're not struggling with that. You don't have to encounter that every day. But the longer we let that metastasize as a societal problem, the harder it's going to be, and the more radical our government is going to have to shift in order to provide for them. Because we can't live in an America where people are on the streets. We can't live in an America where we have mass poverty. It's just not, it's not what our country is. And so our government is going to have to do more, and the way in which we're going to do more is going to be data driven. We're going to use data to better understand and better target communities that have been historically neglected, and communities that need the help the most. In government, they talk about equitable distribution. And by equitable, I mean, it doesn't mean equal. It means the people who have been historically neglected need to be invested in the most right now in order to make up for the past transgressions. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of that, especially if we have a federal government that goes to the left rather than where it is right now.
Yeah, so this is not a political thing, guys. I just letting you know. We're talking. This is definitely political. It sounds like it, I know, but it's really talking about how do you get your data to like work with what you're trying to accomplish. So one of the things, and I don't mean get your data, like how is the data like showing, like uncovering things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So I love what you said about we've had as many people evicted as Woodstock. That's an interesting way of talking about data, right? So how do you take data and turn it into a story? You just took the data and turned it into a story about these people. And then in your data, I've seen it, you also break it down into like who is inside of that data, right? So like the types of populations and people that are inside that data. So how do you work that and not say, well, it's just people that aren't working. It's just people that are, just not paying their rent and they need to, or they're on drugs and I don't know. There's a lot of things, I think, stories that are the contrary of what you just said, that people are taking advantage and so on. So how do you kind of use your data to show what's actually really happening?
Sure. Well, for one, I think that the more that you work with public data, the more compassionate you get for the human condition, because you realize that people with problems are not outliers, they're the norm. And the more I work with criminal justice data, the more you realize like, okay, some people are drug addicts, some people have serious problems, and should they go to jail? What is jail really like? And the more you learn about what jail is really like, you say, well, wait a second, if somebody's addicted to drugs, why are we punishing them in this way? Why aren't we treating them in another way? Why aren't our systems set up to handle the problems that they should be designed to handle? Instead, we sweep people under the rug. We put them in the closet and we shut the door and we don't worry about it. And I think that, the war on drugs is a very relevant example of 20 or 30 years, 30 or 40 years of doing just that. And then you have a system of mass incarceration that disproportionately affects Black people. And you start to wonder, well, wait a second, are Black people doing more drugs? From the studies that I've read, drugs are pretty ubiquitous among all races and ethnicities. Why are Black people being locked up so much? And you start to examine the systems in place. And I think that it's very important. And again, I don't mean to veer into the political, but the more that you look at data, the more you realize the fissures in our systems and how fucked up things really are. And those numbers are so large that it's hard to ignore. So I think one of the ways in which I look at data is trying to do it through a compassionate lens and a non-judgmental lens. I try to do that just personally in general, because I'm a man with many flaws myself. And I would certainly want somebody to look at me compassionately. And I also think about things, since we're talking about, drugs, I think about the opioid crisis and how that can affect anyone. If I were inclined to try opioids, I could be an addict very easily. We're biological machines that are just programmed in ways that, we get manipulated by drugs and by culture, and we end up in a bad spot. And so I think what I try to do is look at the data and then get a better sense and ask better questions about why systems are the way they are. Sometimes there's reasons for that. And sometimes there's very legitimate reasons for why the systems are set up the way they are. In fact, in most cases, there's very legitimate reasons. However, in times of change, in times of massive cultural shifts, we have to re-examine those changes and those reasons for why the systems are the way they are, and question them, and start to look at, for me, I look one side data, one side storytelling, and in the middle is policymaking. How can you take the policies that we have and understand, did they accomplish what we intended? Did the war on drugs accomplish what we intended? And then the question is what did we intend? Did we intend for mass incarceration? If that's the case, then yes, we accomplished it. And then we can recognize what our intentions really were. Because oftentimes when policies are passed, they're either passed with intentions that are obfuscated, or they're passed without intentions, or they're passed in a way that doesn't match the intentions. And so what I try to focus on is looking backwards at what's actually happened in criminal justice, in housing, in environmental justice, you name it, disaster recovery, and saying, did we accomplish what we set out to accomplish? Are we tracking the right things? And when we are tracking the right things, is it telling the story that we want to tell? Houston is recovering. Is it? I don't know. I mean, I'm recovering, but I don't know. There's still thousands and thousands of people who live in substandard housing because of Hurricane Harvey or the 2 floods that preceded it. So I think data can really shed light on our intentions and what we want to do. And I recognize that I'm speaking both from almost a socialist and a libertarian perspective here, because on one hand, we have to look at government as a trusted ally in being able to implement what only government can implement. And on the other hand, we have to be deeply skeptical of government and make sure that the people that we put in power are executing power in ways that match what we want as people, as the culture, as society. And so that's a constant push-pull relationship where data is the central actor, and data is the only thing that will tell us what's going on.
There's some questions starting coming in about this, and I think it's good, but I think the how is kind of what we need to get into now. And I'm going to get to Grace and Renee's questions here in a minute because they're very good. But I'm going to say this: how can data keep government accountable and transparent? That's the question. How do we use data from the public side? Because it seems like data is used a lot by government toward us, and then it's hard to tell what's made up and what's not made up. It's like, how do you know that data is true?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a certain amount of trust that goes into how government reports, and there's a certain amount of skepticism that you have to take. I was just on a call with a professor in New Jersey yesterday or 2 days ago, and we're working on a project, and he said, well, how do I know that the data that you give me is going to be accurate? And I think that it comes from, it's a bit of a practice to be able to understand what's missing. And we work with government agencies all the time. When we get a report and we recognize, hey, this doesn't match this other report that we have, or this doesn't match what you said over here, why is this missing? I think fundamentally the people in government want to be complete and want to be honest, and they're held accountable by the law for that. They can go to jail if they lie, technically speaking. Some lie and don't go to jail, but technically the law is on the people's side. So it's really important for, again, to be hypercritical of what you're receiving and to analyze it really carefully. And then to say, okay, I can accept this as generally accurate, and now I can transform it and put it out there into the world as a narrative.
Yeah, and that's really interesting too. So like if I am so here's a good question. I'm going to bring up Renee's question because I think it's appropriate right this moment. So what are the tools and techniques that enable data to be converted into compelling stories with human relevance and resonance? I mean, like if I'm sitting here as a usually PR marketing professional, I'm not necessarily a data analyst, right? So what would be like the first step if I have some data that I know that I have? How do I start to find data or think about data? Could you kind of break it down to like the beginner level for some of us?
Sure. I was a beginner once too. Sometimes I still feel like a beginner because there's always room for growth. I think number one is embracing the fact that you are a data person. Stop saying to me, I'm not a data person. You are a data person. You know data. You've looked at the back of baseball cards. You've counted cars that go by your street. You are a data person. You only need basic arithmetic to understand data. So stop not being confident about it. So I think that's the number one thing is to build up your own confidence to learn. The next thing is to really understand the subject matter that you're evaluating. I draw a lot of inspiration from data journalists and journalists in general because they come from the narrative side and they're trying to backfill the data learning and they're trying to understand data. And we work with a lot of journalists to do the more advanced data analysis techniques. And so I think understanding what's current and what's relevant and what's a long-standing narrative is very important. So if you read the newspaper every day, you know what's a long-standing narrative. You know the issues that we face. And if you read the Houston Chronicle every day, and you should all subscribe to the Houston Chronicle because that's our local paper. If you read that newspaper every day, then you know the issues facing Houston in particular every day. And then you can start to think about, well, okay, for example, last year, there was a no-knock warrant executed in Pecan Park in southeast Houston. And 2 innocent people were murdered by the Houston Police Department. I'm sorry to go real dark on this, but a no-knock warrant means that the police can just knock down your door. They don't have to knock. They don't have to do anything. They just bust down your door. They don't have to announce themselves. We're in Texas. Everyone's armed. That's a terrible idea. That puts cops at risk. And in fact, 5 cops were shot during that raid. And the evidence is pointing towards the cops actually were shot by friendly fire. But I think that what you have to start looking at is saying, well, why do we have a no-knock provision? What's the data behind that? How many no-knock warrants are executed? Why are they executed? And what cases are they executed? And you start to unravel that. You pull that thread and you start to ask these questions, just why, like a 2-year-old, why? And eventually you get to numbers. Eventually you start to say, well, why are we using this in drug cases? How many drug cases are these used for? And when you hear the mayor and the chief of police talk about it, why they don't want to end no-knock raids is because of kidnapping cases. They have a justification around kidnapping. And I think, then my question is, well, how many kidnapping cases are you executing raids on? Like, why are we keeping these tools on the books for leverage? And so I think the more that you start with the subject matter and start to peel back those layers or pull that thread, that's when you can start to get down to the numbers, because people love to do things the way that they've always done them in the past. And they don't like to rock the boat, especially bureaucrats, people who work for large systems, technocrats, people who are a middle manager somewhere, or elected officials. They don't want to change things unless they absolutely have to. And sometimes you don't want to look under the hood of your own car to realize that your engine's falling apart because you don't want to deal with it. and there's too many fires to put out, and there's too much crap to deal with. And so it's incumbent upon us as citizens to hold our government accountable and to ask those questions. And I find that I'm not tackling big issues of our time. I'm not thinking about how do we get out of an economic recession. I'm looking at things like, why are only poor people being arrested for low-level marijuana offenses? Why are why are certain apartment complexes evicting more people than others? I go down into the minutia because I learned about a particular factoid, and then I just started getting curious, and I started saying, well, where can I find this information? Where does it exist? And I'm fortunate to have a great network of data people and people in government who will help me understand that. But I guess my last point is that when I look at data and getting started, you have to recognize that you're neither an expert in the subject or the data itself. And you have to build capacity and build expertise in both areas before coming to any conclusions. And the way in which you do that is you talk to experts in those areas about how they would do it. And I think it's a muscle that you can develop over time. And frankly, like I'm working on a blog right now around housing facilities for returning citizens, people coming back from prison. And we have some laws on the books in Houston that prevent housing from them. And my analysis is done entirely in Google Sheets. And I use SUM. That's the SUM function. That's the most advanced data analysis technique that I'm using.
Addition, subtract.
Yeah, that's it. It's arithmetic.
Yeah.
So I think that you don't need to be an R or Python programmer to do good. You just have to hone in on an issue and try to be a detective, find the data, and put it in one place.
We got somebody who said that. Tanya Gee said that her nonprofit uses the image that they filled the Toyota Center with the children we served last year. That's like exactly what we're talking about here, is like taking the data you have and conceptualizing it. Because, like, for example, how many of you guys, what was the most recent stimulus? $2 trillion. Like, who has like a concept of what $2 trillion actually is? Anybody? So if any of you guys can come up with a great $2 trillion image, so I would actually love to like challenge you right now. So before this is over, one of you is going to come up with an amazing $2 trillion image for us so we can understand it better. But that's the idea, is also to bring understanding, I think, to difficult topics. I mean, you definitely have taken on very difficult topics, things that are very highly charged, emotional, political, which is like, yeah, I mean, the stuff you're doing, and Census is coming up. And I know you're working with Amy a little bit on Census 2020, which is going to be really hard because you can't have door-to-door knockers this year. So how is that going to work? And how are you going to use that data to really convince people to fill out their forms? You know, because everything that we get in this area, in any area of the country, comes from how many people fill out those forms. All the federal government aid, everything comes from that 2020 census. So it's hugely important that we fill it out. And by the way, you know, some people are insecure out there, so they don't even, this is not even registering in their psyche. I think for if you're sitting in your nice house, it's easy to fill out your census form and send it back in. I filled it out for my business even. I was like, yes, I've done both my census forms. I'll just tell you, already there. But how do you get other people to do that too? So I think these are like, how do you move people with data? And I just love that you have so many examples. You do. So Grace had a question that I think is really good for you. How have you developed a set of questions over the years that helps you get to the root of the problem? Or is ask why, give time still the best starting point? So yeah, your why. You just talked about that a little bit. Anything else?
I think that certainly reading the newspaper every day and understanding what journalists are focusing on, because they're focusing on the newsworthy topics. And if a topic is newsworthy, then it's certainly worthy of multiple brains and multiple sets of eyes feasting on it. I think that I certainly have let my intellectual curiosity drive my politics than vice versa. I think a lot of people come from a political angle and are seeking data to justify their intuition. I start from there, and I've trained myself to be the reverse, to really try to look objectively as much as I can, and then let the data guide me. I think that there are tools and techniques associated with that, and some of it's just programmatic. There'll be times when I get a new data set, and the first thing I do is I build a map, or the first thing I do is I start to aggregate all the points into neighborhoods. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, well, which neighborhoods are more affected than others? I looked at property tax protests last year, and I wanted to know, because I protest my own property taxes. I'm a homeowner. Harris County just mugs me every year, just as they mug most people. And I wanted to know, okay, who's successful in their property tax protests and who's not? And does it matter if you hire a firm or not? I paid O'Connor and Associates, bless their hearts, $18 last year to save me like $400, $500 or something on my assessed value. Was that even worth it? I don't know. I mean, could I have done better myself? So I know that Harris County Appraisal District has all this open data, so I pulled it all in and I started to look at it, and I was like, well, what does this mean by neighborhood? What does this mean by census tract? What does this mean by census block group? Do Black neighborhoods have greater success? Do Latino neighborhoods have greater success? Do Anglo neighborhoods have greater success? What about rich and poor neighborhoods? What about neighborhoods with houses that are worth more than $400,000 or less than $400,000? What about neighborhoods that have a majority of homeowners and neighborhoods that don't have a majority of homeowners, that have a majority of renters? These are questions that anyone can ask. And the more flexible you get, the more nimble you are at asking these questions, the easier they come. And then I start to answer them through programming. And the more I do that, the faster it gets. So I'm relatively quick at building these little prototype maps and doing analyses. And for every blog that I put out, I might have like 4 or 5 analyses, but I've probably done like 40 or 50 behind the scenes, and I've pulled out the ones that are meaningful, and the rest of them just aren't meaningful. So I think it is important to think of this like exercise or like a yoga practice, where you do a little bit every day. Just read the newspaper and ask a question. Read an article by Mike Morris or Sarah Smith or Carrie Blakinger, and start to think about, like, well, what questions are they asking, and what questions does that prompt in my mind? And then think about, how can data help me answer this question? How many inmates are being released because of COVID-19 in Harris County? How many should be released? One last point I'll say on that, which I think is particularly relevant, and it's going to be a subject of our next blog. We talk about releasing low-level offenders, like nonviolent offenders. What does nonviolent mean? I did a study in Wisconsin last year where it was only focused on nonviolent offender diversion programs. And they have a charge there called resisting and obstructing. Now, resisting is violent and obstructing is not. Resisting is punching a cop. Obstructing is not showing your ID. So how can you parse that from the data? And it leads you to a brick wall, because you can't say definitively that that person is nonviolent if they have a resisting and obstructing charge. And I'll tell you something, everyone has a resisting and obstructing charge in Wisconsin. So it makes it very hard to look at a population and say this is a nonviolent population. So when I see elected officials saying we're only going to release nonviolent people, I think that's code for we're not going to release anybody.
Yeah, interesting. And Tim actually asked the question. I'm gonna do this, and then we're gonna go into the tools. There's a good question about tools, and also Sarah already came up with our 2 trillion thing, which I knew you guys would do that. You guys are so smart. So there you are. So Tim asks, has the data ever led you to a conclusion that was very different from where your political or other inclination would have led you initially to assume? That's interesting question to me.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. Frequently, in fact. I think that in general, the data tells me, and this is broad strokes, the data tells me that things are worse than I thought they were. But worse, you can be worse in lots of different ways. I started my journey in data from a very yellow dog Democrat, somewhat libertarian, freedom, point of view. And I still think that fundamentally I'm somewhere in there, that old self is somewhere in there. And the data has led me to more progressive changes, because I see how broad the problem really is. For example, when I first moved to Houston in 2009, 11 years ago now, I knew that Houston is an environmental, it's got some problems. And I was 30 and I was like, well, that's what you get for living in Houston. It's an environmental problem. Like, you breathe the air, like you take the good with the bad. It's got the best people in the world. So, I'll just deal with it. And then I started looking at it and I was like, well, we have what, 30 some odd Superfund sites? What do those Superfund sites mean? And I started doing some research and I learned about the stories of Grace Lane over on the east side by the San Jacinto River pits. And you realize that there are people who move into houses and drink well water, get cancer and die. And then their house is sold again. And those people move in and they drink well water and they get cancer and die. And then the house is sold again. And the pattern repeats. And you think, why are we allowing this to happen? How can we possibly protect our people? And so that inspires this fire inside of me where I'm like, wait a second, live and let live isn't good enough. Live and let live means letting people buy homes in the flood pools and not disclosing to them that they're living in a place that's going to fill with water when we drain the reservoirs. It's not okay to simply have an unbridled state of nature, Lockean kind of world. We have to have some controls in there. And so every time I look at data, it leads me down that path, Tim. I think that that's a really good question. I also think that on the flip side, there have been times where I've looked at data and had non-conclusions, like no conclusion. Somebody's saying the house is on fire, things are really bad. And I look at it and I say, well, it's not that bad. Housing prices in Houston are bad, but they're not that bad compared to Austin, compared to Dallas, compared to New York City, compared
California.
to San Francisco,
Yeah.
California. We have gentrification problems in Houston, but I'll say this, that the way in which we handle gentrification in Houston is, while I wouldn't give us a better than a C minus, most places are an F. So it gives us something to build on. So I would certainly say that when I read about gentrification in the world, and especially in California, and I think, oh, that's terrible. And then I train my focus on Houston. I go, whoa, okay, maybe we're doing some good things. Maybe we're engaging communities in the right way. We're not doing as good a job as we could. We could certainly do a much better job, but we're not doing as bad a job as we could either. So I think that data certainly helps me calibrate to a conclusion that I think is supportable when I talk about it. And that's really what I look for. I'm not looking for something that's incendiary. I'm not looking to push a political agenda. If you read my blog, I speak very politically, but when I write, I don't. I try to simply present what I've learned from the data and what's defensible based on the data. I'm not unbiased. No one is unbiased, and data is not unbiased, but I try to be fair.
I do want to talk about that in a little bit too, because we're seeing a lot of data right now, but I do want to share Sarah's finding. So 11.2, I think she means million. Typical American homes can be bought with $2 trillion, according to Kiplinger link above. So we've got a link, and she says something really, I think this is right, Sarah, that the key is to make big things into small things, and to check out Edward Tufte's work. And I've seen some of that. So yeah, I think that that's definitely what it is that we have to make these things graspable by people. And I think, honestly, I mean, however you feel about the president of the United States, he's good at doing that, making things graspable for people. So how do we do the same? So how do we, for all of the things we're trying to do in our career? So I'm trying to bring this back to the people that are listening, because I know not all of you are doing the kind of work that Jeff is doing, but how do we bring this back to what you're doing? So I want you to apply what you're hearing to your own interest, to your own curiosities, and to the work that you do. How can you bring data into the work that you're doing and make it digestible? Sarah had a great question that goes along with that. And Grace had a great question about, are there any inexpensive tools besides Tableau, which is a great tool, but very hard to learn how to use, that make it easy for newbies to visualize data?
Sure. Tableau, Power BI, there's lots of those off-the-shelf data visualization tools that are pretty cool. There's also,
you dropped out there for a second for the second. You said Tableau, and then what was the second thing? You dropped out a bit.
Tableau and Power BI.
Power BI.
I think it's a Microsoft product, or off-the-shelf data visualization tools. But you can use Canva. I mean, Canva is great for building infographics. You can use Gravit Designer or some of those vector-based drawing programs to illustrate
PowerPoint.
what you're looking at.
Sorry.
You can use PowerPoint. I use
I
PowerPoint.
do too.
I build. I build visualizations in R, and then I take the image and I put it in PowerPoint. I put my text on top and my stuff on the bottom and my credits, and then I grab a screenshot of it. That's how I do it. It's just, I mean, I brute force my way through it to make it look good. And so I think that there's one other thing that I would say is that R, the letter R, is my programming language of choice. It's open source. It's free. There's tons of plugins to it and libraries that you can use. And I didn't know a thing about R in 2016. And I stayed up late every night for like 3 months, brute forcing my way through. And it's great because for a mind like mine, I think programming wise, very linearly. And so I want to see the things happen step by step. And R is really great for that. It's not functions and loops, although you can do that. You don't have to. You can see the transformation of the data as you go. So if you wanted to aggregate everything up into a neighborhood level, you can see that happen step by step. And so I think that going back to what I was saying before, you are a data person. Don't be scared by R. It's a very accessible tool once you build those initial muscles in terms of like how you can do certain things. And the cool thing about it is you do a thing once and you've got the code, so you can do it as many times as you want. And there's libraries and tons of tutorials. So you can download RStudio, and it's just a program that you can use to get started. And if you have some extra time, or if you have questions, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, hey Mark, how are you doing? It's good to see you,
Hey,
man.
Mark.
Mark is up in Austin. Do you find that your political or municipal clients tend to accept or reject your data findings? That's actually interesting because you do have government clients. So is it all political, or how does that all work?
No, typically when we work with the government, it's less. I mean, everything the government does is political. So the projects that we're hired to do are political. We're hired to do the census. That's political. The mayor made a choice to invest in the census. And some people think it's bullshit. Some people think that, oh, we shouldn't be spending local tax dollars on the census, but we should. And it's a smart move. Generally, when we're hired by the government, they accept our data findings because they're hiring us to do a specialist project, working on Hurricane Harvey disaster recovery, working on affordable housing studies, working on diversion program studies. We do a lot of that type of work, and it's very sensitive. So when I was doing the work in Wisconsin last year, I was working with their county executive, essentially their city council lead, their chief of police, their sheriff, their district attorney. And the answers are very clear on what they need to do in order to reduce their jail population. But when you tell a district attorney, hey man, don't prosecute people for shoplifting, he's not going to respond very well to that. He's going to say, I'm doing my job. People are stealing. I have to prosecute this person. So there's a certain tone, and there's a certain objectivity that we try to take with our data analysis when we work with the government. But then there are times when we are funded by foundations to work with nonprofits to do advocacy work. And so what we do then is we try to look at what the government is not seeing and what the policies are telling us, what the outcomes of those policies are. And then we try to make, to your point, Cami, a narrative case and try to get through to people who say, I'm not a data person, what's actually going wrong. So some of our criminal justice work is done with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. They are dedicated to improving the lives of the people who are incarcerated and their families and the returning citizens coming back from prison, of which we will have millions upon millions upon millions of people coming back from prison in Texas over the next few years because they're finishing their drug sentences. So we have to make plans for that. We have to figure out where they're going to live, how they're going to work, where they're going to go, where their kids are going to go to school, things like that. So I think that generally governments accept the findings when they hire us to do stuff. And I won't say they reject the findings, although they have rejected our findings before for some of our advocacy work. But it's a harder road on the advocacy side.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think, there's a lot of nonprofits probably in today listening in, and so those are advocates for certain things that they're trying to get accomplished. I do think data is really important. I know that my work with Civilization, we actually did a national poll to find out how many people had experienced online harassment, and it was pretty shocking. It was a large number of people. So you those kinds of data are interesting in that they also pique the curiosity of media too, to cover something that might be happening in your space. So I think that's another way to use data really effectively, is through polls and things like that. That's an opinion more than actual true data, like the actual things that happened. You've already talked a little bit about the issue with data whenever it's not super clear, like people that have either, you were talking about the offenders, you can't tell whether they were violent or not violent based on their classifications. Whereas you could make a point then to say, hey, we should split those classifications. Like we should have like one classification for this, one classification for that. That would be a policy that would come out of something like that, right? Is that, I'm just trying
Yeah,
to
for
make sure
sure.
I'm understanding.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I think that rewriting how things are classified and having more structure around how things are logged is very important. Even with the evictions, to bring it full circle, things get dismissed and we don't know why. Did the tenant move out? Did the tenant pay their rent? Those are two very different outcomes, but they all roll up into the same, dismissal verdict. So it's
Mhm.
hard to know what actually happens. And so you can only be grounded in the things that you know for certain. And
Yeah.
that's a limitation of a lot of data sets. I will say though, Cami, doing surveys and collecting original data is gold. If you can do that well, you can get a lot done. We work a lot with Combined Arms, which is a veteran service organization here in Houston, and they're like a membership organization full of lots of veteran services organizations, and they collect original data so that we do studies with them, like what's the impact of Hurricane Harvey on veterans?
Yeah,
What's the
interesting.
how has the entrepreneurship ecosystem improved for veterans since 2016 as we've added Bunker Labs and 1836 as a venture fund and stuff like that. When you are able to collect that data, then you're able to show what's actually happening. And some of our policy recommendations from those studies are things like, when you register a business in Texas, you should note whether or not you're a veteran. When you're providing social services, if somebody calls 211, they should ask, and they do, are you a veteran? Because there's all these other veteran services that are open just for those people, and they can be routed appropriately to those right
Mm-hmm.
services, leaving
Yeah.
open seats for other people in other services that aren't veterans.
That's really, really good. And I wanted to actually bring this back to what we're going through right now, because there's just so much data that's flying at us every single day. How many people are dying, how many people are hospitalized. And there's a lot of issues with dirty data, I guess is the best way to do it. It's just not complete, I guess, or I don't know what you'd call that, but an incomplete data, I guess. And we're trying to make decisions right now, for example, about how our society will reopen again on data that I don't know, until everybody's been the testing. Is there enough testing? When is there enough testing? So how do we like look at data and evaluate it, I guess, as people, as individuals? Like when we're looking at the data that's being thrown at us, what things should we keep in mind when we're looking at any data set? But I'm just using this for an example.
Well, I think that the COVID data is unique and interesting for a variety of reasons. Mainly the things that you just said. It's incomplete. It's disingenuous because we're not testing enough people. If we administered widespread testing, then reporting out how our curve is going is fair. But we're not. We're not administering widespread testing. That's a federal issue. And unfortunately, what it means is that if you have garbage upstream, you're going to have garbage downstream. It doesn't turn into gold just because it's in a dashboard. And it's scary too, because a lot of people take data on face value. Every time I put out a dashboard or an analysis, I'm scared. Like I have this fear, this deep-seated fear that I fucked up somewhere and somebody's going to call me out on it. And my OCD makes me get into every little detail and make sure that it's right. And you know what? People don't. They don't check up on it. They don't do their homework. They
Mhm.
trust what they're seeing. And I think that that's dangerous right now. And the flip side to that is that if we have better data, we want to know what parts of Harris County are the COVID outbreaks biggest. Where should we go? Where should we not go? I worry that in the future, this data will be used against people. And that's why we have HIPAA, is because healthcare data will be used against you. Life insurance policies will not insure you. Health insurance policies will not insure you. Who knows what the long-term effects of COVID-19 are going to be? Right now, we have to plan to make sure that that data will not be used against people, or at least will not be inadvertently disclosed to be used against people. And that's a tightrope that we have to walk. I also think that in terms of COVID-19, there's a lot of challenges with reporting, and there's this tension in the government that wants to give as much information as possible, but also wants to blunt the impact. I'm of the mindset that things are bad and getting worse. I hate to be a downer again, but it helps me find my own strength in terms of what can I do, what can I control, what are the things that I can measure, and what are the things that I can study, both in my own personal life and professional life, that can make an impact. And while I can't stop the spread of COVID-19, I can highlight the fact that people getting evicted is a problem. And I can make the connection between housing and public health. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And it's hard. It's very hard. And I wish I knew more about the pandemic and when things were going to happen. I wish our predictive analytics were better. But data is not a miracle. It's just a resource. It's a raw material that we can use in whatever way we want. And so I think this is a tough time for people who work with data.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, it's not their fault necessarily either. We're also just being overwhelmed as a system. There's not any way to completely get there, no matter how great you are. I don't think it wouldn't have been enough. I love how Grace is talking about people are slamming the models too. Can you talk about the purpose of models, how they're developed and why, if they changed? Does that, disqualify them as a source of insight? Definitely, there's a lot of models. I've heard, I actually live with a modeler, so not for this, but he's a statistical data analysis guy.
I've always wanted to be a hand modeler.
I want to be a hand model too, but that'll never happen. You can see these hands; they are not making hand model status. So I think we could talk about the models for sure. Definitely more or better, because it's really a range of things. So could you talk a little bit about modeling and what that means?
Well, modeling is a way of trying to predict what's going to happen in the future based on what's happened in the past. And you've probably heard terms like past performance does not indicate future results when we talk about stocks. Because if you try to model the growth of a stock, all of a sudden you have a pandemic and stocks drop, like all those models break. Models are just guesses. That's all they are. They're really good guesses. They're well-informed guesses, but they are guesses. We cannot predict the future. The future will always throw us for a loop. So models are best guesses, and we cannot take them as fact, because that's not what they are. They can be more informed the better data that we have. And sometimes it looks like a magician, it looks like you're predicting the future because you have all this great data going into the model, and you've got a really well-trained model. Well-trained meaning you've gone through and iterated over and over again. If you read 538, their predictions are based on, a simulation of 1,000 models, or this model simulated something 1,000 times and it broke out in all these different ways, and here's the average, So it's really just a best guess. I think that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Models are only as good as the data going into them. That's right. I think people are trying hard to build good models, but I also think that many statisticians, I forget the exact idiom, but like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yes,
many statisticians are like, I can build models, I can do this thing, so I'm just going to do it and help people. And that's kind of the wrong approach. Sometimes we need to step back, we need to breathe, we need to take in the context of what we're trying to model. And then we have to say, is modeling even appropriate right now? People are clamoring to know the answer of what's going to happen in the future. But if I give you my best guess, but my best guess isn't very good, like to Grace's point, does that mean that people are not going to trust me in the future? I think it's incumbent upon every data scientist and every statistician to make sure that when they give a best guess, that they qualify it appropriately, and that if they can't do a good job with it, that they shouldn't. They shouldn't model it. I mean, they can keep the models there, but they shouldn't be sharing that as fact or as a narrative of what's
Well,
going
I think
happen.
that's the thing. I mean, the fact is that it's not a fact at this point. We can only guess as best as we can, and people do need to know and have some idea of how this is going to go. So I do think that there's going to be a lot of conversation around models over the next months. And so I feel like this is a very good question, and not an easy one to answer either. I do want to push in here because Walter came up with a good one that in 2018, Apple was valued at $1 trillion. So 2 trillion is 2 apples. I like these guys. Keep them coming. They're good. And yeah, there's a lot going on here about there's a lot of awesome conversation here going on. I'm not sure what to pull on in, but yeah, there's some questions about Andrew had a question. This is kind of interesting. Is a very big question. Sorry. Really about the idea of underserved communities and access to internet and broadband. Do you know anybody who's doing work around internet and broadband using data?
Yes, in fact, we are. We just did some work with the Mayor's Office of Complete Communities around broadband access in complete communities. It was just kind of a cursory analysis using FCC data and using census data, but it's fascinating. It's really interesting. I'll give you some examples. In Gulfton, and these are broad examples because the FCC data classifies as in terms of not points, but like ranges. So like in Gulfton, for example, which is one of the mayor's complete communities, also one of the densest, if not the densest neighborhood in Houston, concentrated with renters and low-income families. You have, I believe, don't quote me on this, I'll give you the stats later, somewhere between 2 and 6 families have internet access greater than 200 kilobits per second, which is 4 times faster than dial-up. 4 times faster than dial-up. Somewhere between, I think it's 2 and 4 out of 10 families have greater than 10 megabits per second in internet access, which is about as low as you can get and still be high speed. For context, if you pay Comcast $35 a month, that's 175 megabits downstream. So we're talking 10 megabits. And somewhere around 4 in 10 families have no internet access at home at all. They might be getting it through self-service. They might have a burner. They might have other.
They may have data.
They might be reaching it somewhere. Right. But in terms of residential internet access, they don't. And let me tell you something. 10 megabits per second is not enough to have 2 kids doing video chats. 10 megabits per second is not enough for online learning. And 200 kilobits per second is barely enough to stream a low-quality YouTube video. You can't. So we have massive divides in terms of who has residential internet and who doesn't, and then who has high-speed internet and who doesn't. And I'll put it in context for you. In Montrose, greater than 8 out of 10 households have greater than 10 megabits per second in internet speed. So when we start to look at the differences of people who live in Montrose, River Oaks, the Heights, kind of the affluent neighborhoods of the inner loop and out the energy corridor versus the mayor's complete communities, you do see a massive divide. Probably somewhere between 4 and 8 households out of 10 are at a significant internet digital divide disadvantage, and somewhere around 4 or so out of 10 have no internet at home at all.
Yeah, and I think that's really the thing that we're dealing with right now with kids being at home trying to do schooling, and that's why a lot of the school districts are handing out devices and connected devices too, like devices that actually have data that are coming into them. So I think that's really powerful. That just shows you how many people need that, because there's so I would have to pull the data. I saw it the other day, but there is just so much going on there with kids that are just not able to do this homeschooling stuff. I think it's really interesting. I know Amy Whittle is really passionate about that. I actually did a podcast interview with her that's coming out in another week or so, that 2 weeks actually, that is around, we talk about this pretty in depth. So I love what Amy's done with this as well. I don't know if she was able to stop by today. She's pretty busy with her stuff, but I'm really glad to have that. So guys, we have ran out of time. Unbelievable. I did have a question about what we were using for the technology on this. I think Gabriel asked that. Let me see. Yeah, it was Gabriel. Are we using BeLive for the split screen? No, we're using StreamYard in this case. It's a free program that you can use too. You can download it. There is a paid plan that is not that expensive. I'm actually putting a link to the paid plan that's a referral link, because if you use that link and you decide to go pay, I think they'll give you like $10 off. Like when you first get in there, I think they give me like, I don't know, $25. I don't know. I don't even know what it is. It would pay for 1 month of this, let's just say. So you'd pay for social media breakfast for a month. Thank you. So it's a referral link, but more I'm putting in there because it gives you a little bit of a break. But yeah, you can just go straight there too if you want. So yeah, this has just been really amazing. I am going to say that I know a lot of you have to get on to work and stuff, but if you have a few minutes, we are going to switch over to Blue Jeans, which is kind of a Zoom-like program that we've used for years, actually, for social media breakfast live streaming. But it lets us come into the back end and talk to each other. And I'm able to put you guys into rooms so we could do a fun little split up and go into rooms and talk to each other for a few minutes about this or anything else. I would love to have you guys be a part of that if you have time. It's sort of like our after stuff at, when we're at Alice Blue in the Heights, we would always just stay afterwards and talk for a little bit. So I'd love to have you join us for that. And I'm trying to grab the link for how to get there. Hold on. Katie, you might have it before I do, but you probably don't.
I also wanted to say, just real quick, thank you to all the familiar faces in this chat here, all my old friends, Grace and Mark and
So
Mary
nice.
Jane and Sandra. And if I miss anybody, I apologize, but it's really good to see all faces. If anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm just Jeff, Jeff, at januaryadvisors.com. And I'm more than happy to answer questions. This is my passion. I think about it day and night. So I'm always happy to chat.
Oh, it says it was filtered out on me. So, oh no, maybe you guys got it. Did you guys see the meeting URL there? Do you see it too? Everybody let me know if you see it. So I'm going to actually jump over here. And I don't know if, Jeff, you have a minute to join us or not. It'd be great if you did. But we would love to spend some time with you over there, just having some conversation, having our morning networking session. So I kind of attended to do it all on Blue Jeans, but some things happened around that. So if you guys want to jump over there for a few minutes, it's great. So here you guys are. I'm starting to see people come in. So awesome, guys. Thank you so much for being here today. Really, really appreciate you all being here. And we will be doing the same thing next month. And I should have turned off my volume over here before I started, guys. Sorry. It's like, I can hear myself echoing. Hold on a minute. I'm going to turn off my volume for just a minute so that until you're there. Okay. Anyway, so next month we're going to have blinds.com. They're going to be coming to talk about how they're working with influencers. Even now during this crisis, they're continuing to work with their influencers in some really fun ways and different ways. So come next month, we're going to do it live stream just like this. And the month after that, I'm in the works with somebody to do something as well. So we're going to live stream all the way through June, no matter what happens. But I'm going to ask everybody, if you're anywhere near the Heights, please support Alice Blue. So I've put that in the meeting notes today. I can actually stick it in here. Actually, Katie, if you could grab it off of the event page and put it in here. But if you could call them, they're doing delivery service and also through all the major, I think DoorDash and others. And they're also doing, curbside pickup, including, I think they have like a brunch kind of thing where they have margaritas and whatever in the morning. So, or in the evenings and stuff during the morning. So if you could go over and check them out, please let's support them because we want them to be there and working when we get back to where we can actually go and meet together there. So I'd really, really ask you, they've been so supportive of us over the years. They also were the owners of Canopy, just so you know. So they have been so supportive of this community. And I just want to make sure that we make them understand that we appreciate that. So if you have any way of getting over there, or you're near that area, please make that one of your stop offs for some of your takeout in the next few weeks. That would be awesome. Okay, guys, that's it. Thank you so very much. And I will talk to you soon. Hopefully over here in the side over here when I am on Blue Jeans. So hopefully some of you will join us there. Again, the login stuff is here in the comments. You can just scroll up and find it real quick. All right, guys, take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.